Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the Chattering Teacup.
Hello.
And here with us a guest from across the pond, from the south of the United States, writer Paul Attaway. Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Oh, well, thank you and hello, and I appreciate you having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you on. We are here because your second book in the Atkins Family Series came out in May 2022.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
And it's called Eli's Redemption.
Yes.
Tell us about Eli. Who is he? Where does he come from? What is his story? As far as you can tell our listeners without any spoilers, of course.
That's right. That's the hard part. So Eli is a young man, and in Eli's redemption, he is about, 18 years old when the book starts and around 23 years old when the book ends. And he is from Charleston, South Carolina, which is the heart of the Old South. But he has to escape. He has to flee murder charges of which he is innocent. And so he flees with the help of some people to the Bahamas. And he believes that his stay in the Bahamas won't be very long. He thinks he just has to lay low until the real killer is discovered. But as events unfold, it looks like he might have to live out the rest of his life there unless he can recover his identity. And so the story is about what happens to the young man as he has to go from thinking he might be gone for a month to thinking he might spend the rest of his life there, the transitions that happen. And he meets some people along the way. Some are positive influences and some are real bad guys. And I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. And the book is set in the 70s. I mean, it starts in his more or less present tense, 1978. And then we go back 5 years when the events unfold you just told us about. Why the 70s? Why this particular time?
That's a good question. So I came to writing late in my life. I was a businessman for 30 plus years and had a variety of businesses that I operated. But I got to a point in my life where I was too old to start any new businesses and too young to retire. And no one would hire me, I joke, because I had always run my own businesses. So I ended up coming up with the idea that I could write a book. And I'd been consulting for a couple of companies, but I had in my mind that I'm going to try to write a book. So in order to do that, I began to read books on how to write books, and I'd read blogs on how to write books. And some of the advice that you'll receive is write what you know. So I began to come up with what is it that I know? What could I write about? Well, I had, and then what themes did I want to concentrate on? It said, what genre did I want to write? So all of these questions. So I ended up answering a few, and one of them was, well, I know what I could write about father-son relationships. I had a wonderful relationship with my father. I'm a father. I'm now a grandfather, so I could look at it from different perspectives. I have a brother. I have a sister, so I could write about that. And then I said, well, what else do I know about? Well, I'm born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, also in the South. And so I knew what it was like to grow up in the South. And I was born in 1963. So I know what it's like to be a young teenager in the 70s. Mm-hmm. So I kind of put all these things together. And I said, well, if I'm going to write this story, father and son, I just decided to set it in the South. And my wife and I had just recently moved to Charleston. And so I set the book in Charleston and I set it in the 1970s because I knew what that era was like growing up. Mm-hmm. And then father-son relationships play out heavily in my first book called Blood in the Low Country. And the second book, Eli's Redemption, it's a continuation of the series. So I set the book in the 70s because it was a time frame that I knew about.
Mm-hmm. And did you check the facts if they were correct or if you remember them wrong?
Yes, I did check facts. And that was fun because people began to ask me, said, well, you're writing historical fiction. I go, well, since I was alive, I don't know how it quite could be historical fiction. But it's close because it's almost 50 years old. And so that's maybe what historical fiction is. So I call it nostalgia fiction. And so, yes, I would go back and I would check the facts. Who won the World Series in 1976 and who won the Masters in golf in 1976. So I would put anecdotes into the story and I would go and check, well, who actually won that game? And the primary character in my first book was the father. His name was Monty, and he was a big baseball fan and a college football fan. So I would make sure that those facts were right. And then I tried to find landmarks, restaurants and hotels that were open in the 1970s. And so that was harder. There's been a lot of turnover in Charleston. I had a harder time finding restaurants and hotels that were open in the 70s that are still open today. I found a few. So yes, I would go back and I would be as historically accurate as my memory and Google would make it possible.
And were there any big surprises for you?
Surprises in terms of what I learned, the history?
Oh, what do you remember wrong?
No, I don't think there were any surprises. I learned things that I didn't know, but I didn't learn anything that was like a huge surprise. But I did learn a few things that I didn't know about the time period. Because I was only, in 1976, I was 13 years old. So your world is pretty small in 1976. You really, you learn history, but you don't really have any reference points for it. So I learned some things I didn't know.
And I wanted you to describe yourself as a Southern storyteller. And maybe I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that people from the South put more emphasis on being Southerners than in the other parts of the United States. And as you lived in the South and I was in Phoenix, what are the differences? What's so special about the South compared to the other parts?
Okay, that's a good question. So you've heard of Southern fiction. You've heard of William Faulkner. Eudora Yardley, etc. So I like to joke, there's no such thing as Northern fiction. My wife and I, we lived in Phoenix for 33 years. It's where we raised our children. So we love this country, and every part of this country is extraordinary. There's wonderful beauty, etc. With respect to the South, the history is both extraordinarily fascinating. It's also tragic, but at the same time, it's uplifting in a lot of respects. But we have a food that is unique to the South. We have music that is unique to the South. We have families typically tend to stay here more than they do in other parts of the country where people are more prone to maybe travel. So you oftentimes will have large families that get together. Whereas we lived in Phoenix, there were a lot of people that were born and raised in Phoenix, but most people were from someplace else. The West, most people are from someplace else. So the roots just grow deeper. The country, of course, I mean, if you go back far enough, Virginia, Plymouth Rock, Jamestown, Charleston, those were some of the very first settlements in the country. So the history in this part of the country is as old as any other history in all of America. Charleston was discovered, I say discovered, it was here all along, but it became a British colony in 1663. So the history is very, very old. And I think that's just gives it a lot of depth to it. Of course, we have the history of slavery and the history of the Civil War, which is fascinating and, of course, very sad. But at the same time, in this country, it marks a turning point where the role of this nation was to end slavery, to end our part of it. Sadly, it still goes on today, and it's going on all over the world at certain points of time. So it was the point in time where this country ended slavery, and it was our bloodiest conflict ever. And so it's those experiences leave marks, and those marks can be I don't say uplifting, but they certainly create ripples that continue out and affect life here.
So in essence, one could also say that there is a Southern way of life then.
There's a Southern way of life. There's no doubt about it. And you could say to some extent it's influenced by the weather. You don't want to walk very quickly here in the summer because the minute you step outside, you're just drenched. It's so humid. But just little things like the importance of college football. which is a huge pastime in the South. It's bigger in the South than any other part of the country. Music, the music here between gospel music, bluegrass, country, Southern rock, blues, it's all you throw it all into a pot and you stir it up and you get a particular type of music. So there is a Southern lifestyle. And there's another joke. When people retire here, they very rarely move to New York City. When they retire, they move to the South or Florida. Florida's in the South, but Florida's not Southern. But yes, they move to Phoenix, another wonderful warm climate.
And I also wanted to ask about you move or less, move. You don't move him. He has to flee. Eli has to escape from his fate and to save his life and to save him from imprisonment. And he is helped along, like you said before, by friends.
Yes.
And they bring him to the Bahamas. That also begs the question, why the Bahamas?
Okay. A couple of reasons. So my wife and I, we began to visit Charleston in 2010. One of our daughters attended college here. And then we fell in love with the city, and we decided to, when our youngest child left the house and went off to college, we decided to buy a house here, and we've now eventually moved here completely. So one of the things that the history here is so overwhelming. I'm looking outside my window, and there, within a couple of blocks of my house, there are homes that were built in the 18th century that George Washington stayed in when he visited. So that the history is overwhelming. So I began to relearn a lot of American history that you knew when you were in high school, and I began to study it. So I say all that to say, during the Revolutionary War, in the South in particular, the war was almost a civil war. We had loyalists and we had patriots. The patriots wanted their independence. The loyalists wanted to remain under the crown. Well, when the war ended, the loyalists didn't feel very welcome here, and they fled. And a lot of them went to Florida initially. And then there was the Treaty of 1783, which ended the Revolutionary War. And it ended, at that point in time, Great Britain was fighting with just about everybody. And it ended the war with the Spanish. Well, the Spanish got Florida back for a while. Well, we had all of these British loyalists who had fled the southern colonies to Florida. Well, now they didn't feel welcome in Florida. And about 5,000 of them went to the Bahamas. And they brought a lot of their enslaved people with them, hoping that they could recreate a plantation economy. Well, the Bahamas will not support a plantation economy. It's just too rocky. It really, and so a great number of the enslaved people were just released or freed, or they just walked away. But you had 5,000 British loyalists, and that was British territory at the time. And so the King George III, I believe, granted a lot of these the former Southerners land in the Bahamas. So there is a connection between the Bahamas and Charleston. And then if you go look at the architecture, it's all very similar because it's Caribbean in nature. And a lot of the people that first colonized the South in Charleston, they came from the Caribbean. So they brought a lot of that influence with them. And then over time, the Bahamas has always been used as a place to run the brigades. We had the harbor of Charleston was blocked off by the British during the Revolutionary War. It was blocked off by the North during the Civil War. And then, of course, we had Prohibition in the 1920s where we tried to outlaw alcohol. And blockade runners would stop in the Bahamas, in Nassau, and then from there, they would come into Charleston. So there's always been a very strong connection. So as I learned this, in my first book, you don't find, a lot of things, you don't find out until the right point in time. But because there is that connection, when I was writing the book, I thought, well, where's he going to go? And I go, I'm going to send him to the Bahamas. And so that's why I sent him there, figuring somehow I'll be able to use that in a future book. So that's how he got sent there.
Yeah, and you also have what we always call I would say an ensemble cast of characters. I mean, of course, you have your character Eli and his story, but there are also a lot of people who play a vital part in his story. For example, Mrs. Babcock. She's a very interesting character.
Yes.
An elderly lady who works for the police. And we have Mr. Dawson, who is an interesting character insofar as when you learn about his family history, you think, okay, that's where the money comes from, but there is more money than even Eli can imagine, or his, let's say, his friends or his connections are quite surprising along the way when we learn what's going on behind the scenes. And you mentioned this father-son relationship. What struck me as, let's say, shocking, because the way you started the book with Eli and his mother, she is a very
interesting.
Let's say she's an interesting character.
It's an interesting character, right? I've had people come up and tell me that they would like to kill her. They can't believe this woman. Yes, no, thank you. They are. I think they're interesting as well, and each one of them can kind of own part of the Southern culture. In the South, religion has always been a major part of life. More so than other parts of the country. And so Mrs. Babcock is a surprising character.
Yes.
And there's one of those, there's more there than one would expect. But I use her to also show what church life is like. These are humble people. They don't take themselves too seriously, but they take their faith very seriously. And they're likable people. It's hard to not like them. And they are, Southern, they're just, their religion is very important to them. So I used her to sort of show that part of life. Quaid's family, the money comes from a prohibition. They were rum runners. And then they went, when alcohol was legalized, they just continued. So yes, he has surprisingly more money than maybe one would know. And I keep it somewhat mysterious because it's just, sometimes it's more interesting if it's not fully explained. Yeah. But I think I'm going to have an opportunity in a future book to maybe explain a little bit more about how it is that he ended up becoming as wealthy as he has. But a lot of it does have to do with just connections and friends he's made along the way.
And coming back to Rose, I mean, what she's so afraid of, actually she's afraid. She's afraid. She's a
she lives in
woman.
fear.
Yeah.
She lives in fear, yes.
And I think you said it, or she said it, or she thinks of her. She needs to get rid of her past because people would think of her as white trash because of where she comes from, what happened to her. That is also the motivation for her actions. So I wouldn't say I wanted to kill her, but I thought, goodness me. I mean, you get a sort of understanding. You understand where she comes from. Doesn't mean I condone what she does.
But maybe a bit of pity, because she's always afraid of
Again, yes. And when I was writing this book, my first reader was my wife. And so when she's reading this and she finds out what she does, she goes, Paul, there's no way any mother would ever do this. And I go, I understand. Let me go back and see if I can't write some more backstory. So I provided more backstory and more pain and suffering, again, so you'd understand why she acted the way she did, but it doesn't justify her action. So Rose and Monty are another slice of Southern life. Rose in particular comes from extreme poverty. And in the South, especially in the 20th century, there was extreme poverty experienced by both blacks and whites. And that created a lot of scars. And her religion is the ugly kind. It made her think she was better than everybody. Monty's religion is also is kind of that Protestant work ethic. He thinks you have to work, and you have to earn everything, including people's love and God's love. And you see those influences spill over into their children, where they have this extraordinary pressure upon them to be perfect and to please their parents and to never disappoint them. And Rose's love is toxic. It's smothering, it's toxic. Monty, we can understand. He wants the best. He maybe just doesn't know how. And so his boys tend to misinterpret his love. They know their father loves them, but they think they still have to please him. Mm-hmm. They're not sure about their mother. And so there's that tension between the mother and the father, and it spills over into the boys' lives. All experiences that if you've grown up in the South, you will see people that have these characteristics.
Yeah. Especially, I think, Eli, because are we allowed to say he is a son from a first marriage of Rose?
No, so so they are a blended family. And that certainly affects Eli. Yeah. Not knowing, always wondering if he truly belonged.
Yeah. And he calls her, I think in later in the book, he calls her this dark cloud that was always looming at home. But he doesn't really know why, does he? Not until the end. Not until the end of the book, where he finds out things he wasn't supposed to find out. But
maybe it's better if he knows why.
He does know. He does learn that he is has his own father, a different father. But he doesn't learn anything about that man until later. Yeah. And again, I think in the South in particular, but also that generation, I can't speak to the situation in Austria, but at least in this country, that generation, they didn't air their public laundry. They didn't talk about things that were embarrassing. So Rose and Monty, especially Rose, would have done everything in her power to keep her first marriage a secret and never talk about it and never mention it. And that's both, I think that's true of that generation in this country, and particularly true in the South, where people, if they were born into extreme poverty and managed to rise up out of it, they didn't want to go back there. They didn't want to talk about it.
I find it somehow fascinating that some people are so religious on one hand. On the other hand, they might be divorced, which probably is against their religion. How to combine it in one person? I mean, I think it's an ongoing dilemma.
And so yes, there is religious, and you can be religious about anything.
Yeah.
And so I'd say yes, Rose was religious about being religious. Monty was a bit more tortured by it. He was angry at God. He was like, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And Monty's experience is a change where he comes to realize that Christ didn't want him to be religious. Christ just wanted to have a relationship with him. And so that's an experience that Monty has. So each one of the characters has grown up in this environment, and each one of them has their own experience as to how they're going to adapt or how they're going to change, if at all, in response to the events that happen in their life that they don't think should be happening to them. Because they're good people, or at least in their own minds they were. They don't understand why this is happening to them. And each one deals with that experience differently.
And you said, or you just talked about Rose's extreme poverty. And it reminds me of a play we saw a few years ago about Woody Guthrie. Mm-hmm. And it was quite interesting. I mean, we are not from the United States. We're not from the American South. And this play is more or less about his life, what he experienced as a child, as a boy, and like you said, the extreme poverty, and his parents who had fields and they worked on the fields, on the cotton or tobacco. What was it?
I'm not sure. Was it the standard of living, or the low standard of living in that time was very surprising?
Yeah,
pretty low, pretty poor.
Yeah,
very poor. Right. Yeah.
And not just for the black people, also because his family was white, so they experienced or suffered the same things in essence.
Yes, they did. Horrible. So the poverty was extreme. We still have poverty in this country, but not nearly what it was, 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. When it was more subsistence living. You didn't know where your next meal was coming from. You might have 8 people living in a 1-2-room building, and you were day laborers. In the Western United States, you had, and Steinbeck writes a lot about that. It was grapes and orange trees and et cetera. And in the South, it was cotton, tobacco, and then, also agriculture and nature. But and then the coal miners in the Appalachians. All extreme poverty.
Yeah, she makes it. When she marries Monty, she makes it, and they are maybe I'm wrong, upper middle class, maybe.
Correct. Yeah? That would be accurate. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then when Eli comes to the Bahamas, he has friends because he met good people through Mrs. Babcock and Mr. Dawson. But we also learn at this time the Bahamas is gaining its independence. And becomes a member of the Commonwealth.
Yes.
But it is also used for the rich, where they keep their yachts and they enjoy holidays.
Maybe
tax havens.
Yes.
Tax evasion.
Yes. Exactly. And you also bring in the element of, let's say, fraudulent people, where money is very important, and also it's more or less between the United States and the uprising. It was already there. The communist influence, the question of communist influence in Bahamas. So,
I threw that in. I thought it was interesting that he was there in when they were gaining their independence, and it was and so he was there during July, and he's thinking, well, I should be at home for our July 4th, our independence. And Eli had a hard time getting excited about their independence. It's just because it wasn't his. But I needed to introduce this other character, Nash, who is another interesting character that I think we'll see more of in a future book. And so at that point in time in our nation's history, we had the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was, and to some extent China, but primarily the Soviet Union was instigating rebellions in the Caribbean and in South and Central America. And of course, Cuba was the great loss when Cuba and Castro came along, and they're just 90 miles from our coast. So the Bahamas gained their independence and had a black prime minister named Pendling, and he had been in the Independent Party because the Bahamas had been basically ruled by the Loyalists. The Loyalists who came over in the 18th century, they brought their British ways, and they were productive. They were all about business. And the Bahamas are like 700 islands, loosely organized with no real industry. So they transformed the islands. And so you had an island nation that was overwhelmingly black, and it was ruled by a very small minority of white people. Now, the race relations there are surprisingly good. They really are. I've been there a few times. They're surprisingly good. But back then, no doubt, there was a fear of this transformation.
Yeah.
Because Pendling was not a communist, but he was certainly more left than the Bay. They called them the Bay Street Boys, East Bay Street, which is where all the businesses were, the banks and the lawyers. And so at that time, there was communist revolutions happening in other nations. And there was a fear, what's going to happen to the Bahamas? Are they going to go the way of their other nations? And they never did. Yeah. Now, and Pendling ended up, I think, being remembered as a good man, best of intentions. He did get wrapped up with a genuine bad guy who was a financial criminal who fled the United States. And it did taint his time in office a little bit. But the Bahamas have been, by and large, a stable country. And so those fears of them becoming another communist stronghold never materialized.
Okay. And also a certain sport plays a major part in your book, which I have to admit I know nothing about.
Right.
Golf. I suppose you are a passionate golfer yourself.
I am passionate. I'm not as good as I'd like to be, but yes, I am passionate. Yes. So, Eli is 18. He's 18 years old when he has to flee. He's a senior in high school, and he's a promising athlete. Baseball was his gift. And so he's and he had dreams of playing in the majors. He was that good. But so now he has to flee, and he has to hide his identity. He has to come up with this whole new name. But I couldn't have him just abandon his athletic prowess. Yeah. And so I said, well, what's he going to do? And said, if it's, write what you know, I know golf. And so I had him be a golf prodigy. And that was a lot of fun to write that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I felt a bit lost, I have to admit it, because...
Yeah, no, I understand. Right.
I don't know anything about it.
I don't know anything. Right.
You've got, kind of a stick and you hit the ball. That's about as much as we know.
Yeah. And
you have to
walk a lot,
Yeah.
And you have to get to into the hole. But
yeah. No, I remember when our oldest child, she was probably 5 years old, and I took her out one Sunday afternoon to ride in the golf cart with me, and she could go play golf with Dad. We were just going to go play a little bit. And I stand up and I hit the ball, and I did not hit a good shot. I hit it over into the trees, and she could tell that I was frustrated. And she goes, Daddy, what's wrong? I said, well, I hit the ball into the trees. And she goes, well, why'd you do that? I go, I don't know. So yes, if you don't know the game, it does appear to be pretty silly.
No, but just no understanding what
the rules.
Yeah, what's going on exactly. And what I found interesting in the way you wrote is that you write a third-person narration, and then you switch. We get the narration in first person completely from Eli's point of view. How difficult was it for you to not let him know things he couldn't know?
Yeah, no, it was difficult, but it was fun, and I thought it ended up working well. Mm-hmm. The story was his story as to what was going on in his head and how he was going to deal with this. So I wanted to write the story through his eyes, but yet at the same time, I had a lot of other background material that had to be included. So I wrote Eli's Redemption as a sequel to my first book. Yeah. But I also wanted to write it so that if you hadn't read the first book and you just picked up the second one, you could still enjoy it. There would still be a complete story there. So I had this background information about what happened to him. And then I had all these new characters to introduce. I had the Scottish golf instructor. I had the character of Nash. We had to learn a little bit more about Quaid. And so I how do you introduce backstory about characters if your book is in first person? It can be a little bit more challenging. Yeah. So I decided to exactly that. The first part of the book is the setup. It's going back in time. What happened? Yep. How did he arrive? And so but once he arrived and he had escaped, and all that previous material had been covered, I said, okay, you're right. I immediately switched as section 2 of the book starts. My name is Eli Atkins. This is my story. And so then I've kind of placed the reader in current times, and I carry that reader all the way up to when he returns to Charleston. And because the first book, Blood in the Low Country, covers the same 5-year period, and the second book covers the same 5-year period, but it's through a completely different perspective. I got to a point in the story where I said, it's now time to go back to the omniscient voice to wrap up all the stories. Because there were about 3 stories going on. But it was difficult. I had to continue. I had a lot of notes I made. Who knows this? Who knows this? When did they learn this? To try to make sure that I revealed things to the characters as well as to the readers. Because actually, the readers knew everything. Yeah. Not everything, but the readers knew a lot more than the characters did. And so I did have extensive notes as to what each character knew at particular points in time so that I would, not mess it up.
Was it difficult for you to not repeat in Eli's Redemption something you already more or less revealed in the first book? Or did you ever have everything in?
No. I had to write it down. I wrote down like the previous. There were things that happened a month. The first book ends in a climactic way, and so and And in the second book, we come back to that same climatic event, and then we go further beyond it. Mm-hmm. So I had a detailed calendar written down of what happened on each day so that I could remember. So I could remember exactly what happened. So then there is about a week period that is covered in the first book and in the second book. And it's the exact same events that happen in the exact same order. Mm-hmm. But I reveal to the reader the perspective of another character of what else was going on while this thing was happening. So in the second book, Eli's Redemption, it's the same time frame. It's the same events, but they're told through a different perspective. So you learn what else was happening. So it's not repetitive. Mm-hmm. Same time frame, same events, different perspective, and new facts get introduced. So I hope it's not repetitive.
Sounds very challenging.
Yeah.
When you wrote the first book, did you already plan the second one to take that into account?
When I sat down to write the first book, I had no intention. I had no idea if there would be a second book. And then I got probably about 3/4 of the way through, and I realized there's a second book here. And so I went back and I began to plant a few things in the first book that I could use as jumping off points in the second book.
Mm-hmm. So you've been a planner right from the start then?
No. I had started this endeavor, and I said, I'm going to write this book. And I had half a dozen legal pads full of notes, full of ideas. And so my wife and I were here in Charleston. We had been going back and forth between Phoenix and Charleston, and our house is very tiny. It had no room for anything other than like a kitchen table, a couple of bedrooms. That was it. And so I had no place to work. So I would walk about a 7-minute walk up the street to a public library. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's a private library, but it's very inexpensive to join. Mm-hmm. So like $100 I could join for the year. So I would go and I would sit at this library and I'd start writing. So I sit down day one and I'm literally the blank sheet on my laptop, and I have no idea what I'm doing. I can't write. And so anyway, after a few hours, I just get up and I go for a walk, and I'm just really frustrated. A couple of nights later, my wife and I were having dinner with a couple we had just been introduced to, and they were a bit older than us. They were fully retired, and the husband in this couple had a career as a film editor in California, in Hollywood. And he had been in writing rooms. He'd been involved in editing, not just film, but editing stories. And so he's like, Paul, what are you doing? We just met these folks and we didn't know anyone in common. So I felt safe in telling him, I'm trying to write a book. And he says, what's your book about? And I'm stumbling along. I don't even really know. And he gave me some great advice. He said, stop trying to write a book. He said, just write. Just write. Write a scene, write scenes just right, and stitch it together later as a story. So that's what I did. The next day I went back to the library and I just started writing. And after a few days, I had about 10,000 words, and like, wow, this actually worked. And that very first chapter in my first book was the very first thing I wrote. And it got edited a lot, but it worked. So now that's what I do. I just write, and I have an idea of where I'm going, and I have a few landmarks. And then as I start writing it, I start seeing where it's going. And then I might plan out like the next 3 or 4 scenes or chapters. Okay, I need to get this character from here to here. I need to set this up. And so I'm becoming, I guess I'm sort of a planner and a pantser. I'm half planning, half let's see how the story plays out. And that's still the way the way I'm doing it.
And how much influence does an editor have on your writing then? Would you agree to a lot of editing? Would you get rid of characters if the editor would say so? Or would you say, no, that's my story?
See, where's the limits?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I had, I never worked with an editor before. I'd never done this before. So I had good editors for the first 2 books. And of course, they found mistakes. They found just like the mistakes that you can't see. But in terms of character building and story development, they served a very valuable role, and they showed what I was missing. It said your characters, what does this character look like? We need to know more about this character. Does this character have any tics that they always rub their chin? Help the reader visualize the character. So they liked the story. There wasn't a whole lot of work in making the story work in terms of plot and twist and things such as that. It was more help the reader see the characters. And so I go back and I added a lot more depth to the characters. My second book, my editor encouraged me to remove some scenes that he said added nothing to the plot as it was moving forward. And I said, yeah, I'm going to keep it. I felt that it added color to the story. And so, I kept them. So, and I don't know if that was the right thing or not, but I wanted to. So I kept them.
Yeah. And was it ever hard for you to decide how much to keep? I mean, there was quite extensive research, also the background information of your characters.
Yeah.
How did you decide what to leave and what to get rid of?
Yeah, I'd say when I did edit the second book, I did end up taking out more than I ended up adding. And I just, like, for instance, the bad guy in the second book, we go back, we find out his backstory. I had much more written about his background. Yeah. And I just decided it's not necessary. I needed to provide the reader with an understanding of why the character behaved the way they did. And to the extent their backstory doesn't justify their bad behavior, but it explains their bad behavior, it was important. If I had accomplished that goal of letting the reader know where this person comes from, both literally and figuratively, then I was done. Yeah. And so I use that as the standard for extra, not adding. You're going to lose your reader. Get rid of it. So that was how I decided what to keep and what not to keep.
And the book as a whole, I mean, it can be read as a standalone. Even if you don't read book number 1, you can read number 2 and you find out what you need about Eli and his story. And I mean, it's more than just a thriller, isn't it? I mean, there is, of course, this thriller element in the book, but there is also a lot about, let's say, lost dreams, lost opportunities, family, friends. What makes a family again? Because we know, like we said before, Monty is not Eli's biological father, but he is his father.
Right. He's his father, absolutely.
In every sense of the word.
Yes. When I finished my first book, tried to become published, and so, long story short, I'm self-published. But I did find some help along the way. I found through Googling and through interviewing a few people, a consultant, and this woman has 30 plus years experience in the publishing industry, and so she was going to help me figure out, how to get my book cover done, and how to get ISBN numbers, and how to get what all this means. So she didn't know the answer; she knew who knew the answer. So she was my consultant, and one of the very first questions she asked me when I was telling her about my book is, "Well, Paul, what's your genre?" And I go, "Oh, I don't know. Never thought. I just wrote a book. I just wrote a story." And from a business marketing perspective, the fact that my book does not neatly fit into a genre, I think actually makes it harder for me to sell this book. Because you're right. It's not a pure suspense thriller, but yet there are parts of it that are suspense thriller. It is family drama, but yet there's some crime detective in it. It could be described as Christian literature, but yet we have characters, we have some sex, and we have a murder, and we have some bad language in the book, And so I have received comments online and emails that say, I liked the religious aspect of your story. And I have others who says, how dare you call yourself a Christian when you use those naughty words? So I received both reactions. So yes, family drama. There's definitely some Southern fiction, there's some suspense thriller. So they don't neatly fit, but I think they're fun reads. I think when you put the book down, hopefully when you read the last chapter of both books, you're smiling. And that's what I would hope, that maybe you learn something that you go, oh, that was interesting. I didn't know that about Bahamas, but also that you end up rooting for the characters, and that you end up going, that was fun.
A lot of books don't neatly fit into one category nowadays.
Yeah.
But may I ask, because I've never heard it before, what is Christian literature?
Okay. So if you were to, go on to Amazon and you can put in filters and search, it is a genre. And I have read very little Christian literature, but basically the protagonist in the story most likely is a person who would call themselves a Christian. They believe Jesus is who he says he is. And they will have their faith challenged along the way by events that happen in their life. And they'll and there may be a bad guy in the book as well, but they come back around, and throughout the book, the characters will exemplify what one might call Judeo-Christian values. But I would imagine that most of the books don't have maybe some of the graphic material that mine do. So there is a genre of Christian literature. If you go and you were to Google Christian literature on Amazon, you'll find a lot of books. And there is a definite market for that. There are Christian themes that run through my two books, more so in the first book than in the second book. In the second book, we have Mrs. Babcock, who is just a wonderful person, and she belongs to a prayer group, and they pray. And but for me personally, I'm not a fan of organized religion. It just doesn't work for me, but I do believe that Jesus is who he says he is. I would be what one would call a Christian. I believe that his death and resurrection accomplished a glorious purpose for all of mankind. But at the same time, I see all of us as very flawed. People can live lives that are just riddled with bad, destructive, selfish decisions. And at the end of the day, they can fall down on their knees and receive forgiveness. So I believe that, people come to know Jesus not because of the things that man does to each other, but despite them. So anyway, I have characters in my book that are challenged. And, so I have some characters that are believers and some that aren't.
They're just human.
Yeah.
I mean,
they're just, right.
It's not just black and white. Yeah. There's a lot of gray, and they're all human. Mrs. Babcock is also human. She's human.
She is.
I mean,
she is.
Like everyone else in the book.
Yeah. She's human. She is. She breaks the law in order to accomplish what she believes to be a greater good. Yeah. No, exactly. The only perfect people I've ever met in this world, I can't stand them. Really, think about it.
Because
who likes a perfect person?
Yeah.
Nobody.
And you can't relate to them if they're human and they have their faults.
Right. Yeah.
You can relate to that.
Yeah.
You can relate to that. And people that have experienced pain and suffering are typically the people that you're most likely to experience true empathy and sympathy with, because they've walked in your shoes, they understand, and they don't judge. They just come alongside and they offer help.
Especially if they didn't become bitter, and if they've learned and they've grown through the things they have experienced. And I think Mrs. Babcock is someone like that.
She does. And we learn about that in the second book. We find out her backstory and why. Yeah. And then Rose is as bitter as can be. And bitterness has ruled her life, and it's crushed her ability to experience love. She doesn't. And so, in the first book, I had to decide, am I going to redeem her? Am I going to allow her to continue on in this sorrow state? So that was a big decision to make as to what to do with her. And so, I have a scene in the first book where Monty, he does what Monty was put here to do, and that is to love Rose and love her. And that his unconditional love for her is what finally breaks through, and her bitterness begins to, evaporate. And she's able to start to see the error of her ways, and she's able to start to accept that she is, in fact, lovable.
Yeah. She's a challenging character.
She is a challenging. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. The most challenging one in the book, because, like you said, for Eli, we root because he's our hero. And
he's your hero, right? You root for Eli. Yeah.
Absolutely. His story, his background, everything he experiences. And like you said, there's a lot to take from the book. Family, friends.
Thank you.
About your dreams, not to give up your dreams.
Right.
Just keep on hoping and trust in your friends as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
He was helped by an unlikely group of people.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, exactly. Paul, what would now, after book 1, book 2, and more to come, what would be your advice for any other aspiring author?
Aspiring author. I really, I mean, the two things that really helped me, I'd say one, the advice that we all get, write what you know. Mm-hmm. If your first book is going to be, say, historical fiction, and you have to go and learn about a different culture, a different time period, a different dress, a different everything, you're taking on a lot. You're learning how to write and research, and you're taking on a lot. So write what you know. You've at least, you're in a comfort zone. You're in a comfort zone there. So that advice, I think, is sound advice. And then the advice that my friend gave me, and he's now a friend, we had just met that week, and that is just write. If you, and now I can't tell you how people that have written 40 and 50 books do it. They have an ability to see the end. I kind of know the beginning, and I have an idea or two of like wow, that'd be a great way to finish the book, or that'd be a good scene. Mm-hmm. But I do think that you have to write, and you have to get over the fact that things you're going to write, you're going to end up not using. Mm-hmm. You're going to end up throwing away. And that can be very hard. And you might write a scene and you become so enamored with it that it then begins to limit, because you're like, well, I got to use that scene. And you go, but that's I've written myself into a corner, and you might have to just throw that scene away. So just write. Mm-hmm. And in the writing, you'll get better at it. But then it's, people say, so, Paul, you don't work anymore. I go, I work every day. Do you write every day? I go, no, but sometimes I'll be out on a run, or I'll be at the market, buying something for dinner. And all of a sudden I go, wait a minute, that could work. And I email myself. I go, that could work. So, you get these ideas going, and you might be, at your desk in the morning and nothing's happening. And then that afternoon you go, wait a minute, that's it. So, you're always working. Yeah. So.
And what about your plans, future plans? Is there anything you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, well, I'm working on book 3, mm-hmm. and ostensibly it's going to be about Walker, who is Eli's brother, mm-hmm. in the 2 mm-hmm. books, mm-hmm. and we see a bit of him in book 1, not so much in book 2, and so I'm working on a book that's going to elaborate on him. And I'm a bit trapped. I've been doing a great deal of research. Given his age, mm-hmm. I think I'm right now. I have him placed in Russia in the early 1900s, and he's running into the oligarchs as the oligarchs in Russia are rising up. Mm-hmm. And so I've been doing a lot of research mm-hmm. on the oligarchs, and so I have branched out. I'm now doing. It's not historical fiction, but I'm trying to imagine what life for a 32-year-old young man would be if he's living between, Zurich, Switzerland, and Moscow. Those are going to be his 2 home bases. So I'm working on that as a storyline. And so I'm not much of this book. I mean, he's still going to have connections back to Charleston, but we'll see how much of it mm-hmm. is actually set here. So mm-hmm. I'm working on that. And then I have a true historical fiction book that I'm working on that will be set in Charleston in the 1780s, right after the Revolutionary War has ended. And so I've got a story I'm working on there.
Oh, sounds like a lot of action.
Yeah, well, we hope so.
A lot of research.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, a lot of research. Yeah, but it's fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you might even let him experience Vienna in this time, because rumor has it that Vienna has always been in the center of spies, at least during the Cold War.
Vienna has always been a great spy city.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Daniel Silva?
No, you?
Yeah, Daniel Silva, he's written about 20 books, and his primary character is a member of the Mossad. He's an Israeli spy, and his books a lot of them take place during the Cold War, and Vienna plays a big part of a lot of his books. Yeah. Between Vienna and Berlin, those are sort of the 2 spy hotspots in Europe.
And it shows you what we missed by still living here.
Yeah, obviously, because you read about it in books and think, oh, okay, interesting.
I had no idea. Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, Paul, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
No, this has been great. I appreciate it. You all have asked great questions. So, I mean, if they want to learn more about my books, they can go to paulattaway.com.
I will put that in the description.
Thank you. Yeah, they can find me. I've written a few short stories that I put up there. I blog occasionally, and they can find links to Amazon, etc.
Wonderful.
Very good.
So, thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for doing this.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.